I've been excited by this as well. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you all, sort of kindred spirits, really. I know the average age is slightly less than my age, but I think one of the things I'm going to talk about today is issues that I think challenge all of us, actually, across the generations. And I'm really proud to be the first professor of social mobility, because I am myself a story of social mobility, and I'll talk a bit about that. And I'm going to give you, and I hope I'm not going to depress you all too much, because I know everyone's struggling in lockdown too, and I am, to be honest with you. It's really tough times for all of us. But there are some quite somber statistics I'm going to show you from various studies I've covered. And I think these are particular issues for you, the COVID generation you've been called. You might not like that moniker, but certainly that's been used for the younger generation particularly. But I want to also talk about some of the positive things that we can do, both for you as individuals, but also in terms of maybe creating a sort of movement in a way, which in many ways is what the 93% group club is about in some respects, in my view. How can we create movements to challenge some of the things, the inequalities in society? So I am, as I said, proud to be the first professor of social mobility, and my story, I'm not going to give you the whole story. We'll do that another time when we meet face to face. But I was the first person in my family to go into higher education. I lived on my own at age 15. I actually dropped out of school, but sort of came back into school and then ended up doing a PhD. So I was called the eternal student by my friends eventually. But education, in a way, transformed my life. And as you said, Annie, I eventually became chief exec of the Sutton Trust charity, which many of you will know. And now I'm a professor, and I've even got an OBE, which was a bit of a weird experience for me, being in front of Prince Charles and getting that medal. That was yeah, something that I'll remember for many years. So I guess this is a personal as well as a professional passion, and it means a lot to me personally. We mentioned the books, and I know some of you have got the books. The one I guess a lot of people talk about is that Social Mobility and Its Enemies. It's a Penguin book that we produced a couple of years ago. The What Works book is really more for teachers and how to improve the outcomes for disadvantaged pupils in the classroom particularly. And the Green Book is just out and has just been named by the FT as one of the books of the year, which is really, really exciting. But if you want more, these are very heavy going, these books. But if you do want to look into these issues more, then please do get a copy. I might even be able to get some sort of discount if some of you are interested, and I can talk to the publishers. So one of the things that we talked about in that book is this, and I really hope I'm not going to depress you all with this, but you are a generation that is different in many ways to the generations in Britain since the World War II, in that you're experiencing what we call an absolute decline in social mobility. So in absolute terms, people that are growing up now are earning on average in real terms less than their parents did at a similar age. So every generation, including mine, on average has done better than the one before. And there's many reasons for this, but your generation, and you can see this in things like access to getting houses. When you all graduate, you'll find this. It's harder now than ever before. And there's all sorts of reasons for this, which we can go into, but this was happening, this context really was happening before COVID came along. So there were always going to be challenges, in my view, for this generation in particular. And it particularly hits, by the way, people who don't go to university. So those doing more manual jobs, for example, particularly are struggling. And this graph, I'm going to bombard you with lots of data, so I'll share these slides after the event. This graph is another one that I've used in presentations from the book. And the point of this graph is an international comparison. And what you find is that both Britain and United States are immobile, so they have the less social mobility than other nations, and you'll see all the flags there. And this is less chance of climbing the social or income ladder of life. So if you start off from the lower rungs of the ladder, your chances of climbing are relatively low in Britain and the US. It always makes me laugh because when I present at the United States, the land of the American dream, nothing could be further from the truth. And in many ways, I believe that Britain has taken on many of the societal assumptions of the United States. You know, I think we've become quite an individualistic society. We might get into that later in the debate. But the other axis, the x-axis on this, is the levels of inequality. And what we know from the evidence is, and it might not surprise you all, that the countries that have the lowest social mobility have the highest inequality. So the rungs of the ladder, if you like, are further apart. It makes sense to me, and I've used many studies to try and prove that. So I think if any politician is serious about addressing social mobility, they'd have to tackle inequality outside the education system. And that means we can only do so much in schools and indeed universities. We'll come back to that. So one of the things that we've also done over the years is present these statistics that shows that British society is particularly sticky at the very top and the very bottom. And this is a graph that looks at the proportion of those from private education backgrounds who are among the leading people in a number of different professions. What's interesting is that when we looked over the last 50 years, these proportions remained about the same. So this is an incredibly sustained elite. Again, we can get to a debate about why this is the case. My point in presenting these sorts of slides is that we're missing out, in my view, on the 93% of people that come from the state system. We're not doing enough to, in my view, to develop their talents. We won't get into this as much in this discussion, but just so you know, another strand of my research relates to what I call the lost souls. And these are the children that leave school without basics in numeracy or literacy when they leave school. And in many ways, I think this is the bigger problem. About 25%, depending on how you define this, in England, and of course the United States, again, comes up really badly in these international comparisons. I think this is the other side of social mobility. It's the same children from the same families that end up not benefiting from the school system. We could probably do a whole session on this, but I'll move on. So COVID, you know, do you remember at the early onset of the pandemic, there was this discussion around it's the great equalizer, you know, that it affects everyone, doesn't matter whether you're rich or poor. Our research, and this is research I'm doing with government research council funding, actually is showing that it's, in terms of education, and I think in many other things actually, it actually has proved to be the great differentiator. It's widening inequalities. I told you I was going to depress you, didn't I? So we looked at those pupils in the system that effectively were having a full school day in that early, do you remember the early days of the pandemic when there were partial school closures? And what we found was that those from private school backgrounds were twice as likely to have a full school day. Some of this was online provision, some of it was offline, but there seemed to be an elite that were insulating themselves from the pandemic's effects, while everyone else was being affected to some degree. We found a quarter of pupils received no lessons at all, and they probably are the same group as those lost souls I talked about earlier. We'll come back to the private tutoring issue, but we also found this huge gap in private tutoring, that the richest parents were paying for private tutoring for their children far more than those from less rich backgrounds, as you'd expect. I pay for private tutoring, by the way, for my children. So this is not to say we shouldn't do that, but again, I worry for those children that don't have those benefits. Now, this slide I use and I share with teachers. I just wanted to share it with you just to put into context because I think we'll come on to what universities can and can't do. But the thing that we discuss with teachers is that schools can be transformative. They transform my life. But I believe that in national debate, we need to put into context what schools can't do as well as they can do. And this comes back to my inequality argument. There are so many things happening outside the school gates, the universities, that shape young people's lives. And unless we address some of these issues, then again, we won't see social mobility improve. For those who were on earlier in the call, we were talking about the Marcus Rashford campaign, which I think is very powerful because it's trying to address the basics, you know, whether young people from all backgrounds are eating right. And I think we underestimate the extent of inequality in the country. I got my son Jack to sort of do a picture. This is more for the teachers when I present them. And it was really interesting to me what he came up with. So that I think there are increasing expectations put on teachers to solve all these other societal issues. And I think we need a sort of national debate about that. Either we pay schools and universities more money to address some of these issues, or we tackle these issues outside the school gates. You can't not do those. And at the moment, it feels like there's too much pressure being put on the education system. So in the books, we also talk about this thing we call the education arms race. And that really is the phenomenon whereby over the last certainly 40 years or so, what you've seen is that the middle classes, particularly parents, are investing more and more resource into their children's development, their education. And we'll come on to some of the reasons for that. But as a consequence of this, what's happened is, despite the expansion of universities over the last 40 years, while you'll see in the mauve bar there that the proportion, the numbers from the poorest fifth of homes in the country, that has gone up. There has been progress. The green bar shows that those from the richest has gone up even more. So in many ways, the graduation gap, the social class graduation gap, if you like, has actually increased despite the expansion of universities. And there's a kind of golden rule in social mobility studies that you open up an opportunity and it will be the middle classes that grab that opportunity the most. So there's always debates about how do you enable a more equal society so that all people get those opportunities. I've talked about private tutoring. We've seen a boom in this outside schools. And again, the worry is that it's only those that are able to afford it that benefit from it. I've actually said to other debates that I think increasingly A-level grades are as much a signal of the support that young people have had as any notion of academic potential or achievement. I'll be interested in all your views on that, because I think that then challenges the notion that should we place as much emphasis on those grades as we do at the moment. This was a quote from, I don't know if you remember, there was this big scandal in the United States a year ago, probably a bit more now, 2 years ago, and this is where famous actresses and actors were paying for to cheat, basically, to get into some of the top American universities. And I'm not suggesting this goes on maybe in Britain, who knows, but it was really a really interesting example of how far people will go now to gain that competitive advantage. And the point that was made by this attorney was that the problem is, for every winner, there is a loser. So for everyone who cheats to get into that top university, someone else doesn't get in. So these are difficult debates. So in the latest book, we talk about society's fairness test. And I don't want to get too heavy with you all at this early evening slot, but I do think that these debates I'm talking about are really relating to sort of fundamental issues about the state of our society. And what in every society, I think what you're trying to do is balance the freedom for people and parents to do the best for their children, but you don't want that to mean that if you're from a disadvantaged background, you've got no chance at all. And I think we almost need a fundamental debate about this. So I think there's been a tipping point, and we've gone past that point. And I use this dramatic picture to shock people in my presentations, because I think it really highlights to me the unlevel playing field of life that we inhabit. Of course, these days with COVID, it'll be an empty stadium, wouldn't it? But you get the idea. So I'm not going to be able to go through these in detail today, but there's a lot of proposals that I discuss with the government and others about how you do level the playing field. I think you need to talk about things like a wealth tax to tax the very wealthy to help others that don't have support, as we talked about. I think we should create a vocational stream in schools so that those that don't go to university have better support. I think for universities, we need fair admissions. We might come on to that. And there's other things there, but I can answer questions if there are questions on those sorts of proposals. Fair jobs is really about the gig economy and making sure that those who are on short-term contracts don't just get the minimum wage, but get minimum rights as well. I think we need a discussion about that. So moving on to some of the things I think we can do, and I wanted to offer you some personal advice as well, because I thought, talking to Annie about this, that, you know, I can give you all these shocking statistics, but I also wanted to sort of frame this discussion around what can we do about all this, because I do think the COVID crisis offers an opportunity to reset society. I'd go as big as that, and I think the young generation have got a real role to play in that, probably the prominent role in it. But in terms of, you know, I've called this Lem's life lessons, my life lessons, and this is less based on research and more my own life story and what I've found to help. This is to help you all individually in terms of getting on life. Some of this stuff you will have heard from before, no doubt, but I'll go through them very quickly. One thing that I learned later in life was to be unashamedly assertive, right? And I do think that these are averages, of course, but often state school educated people won't be quite as assertive as they can be. And when you've been a chief exec like me, you will get inundated with requests, and believe me, those from more privileged backgrounds will really go for it in a way that is so unashamed, it will surprise you all. So one thing that I am now, actually, and it's taken me 50 years to get there, is I don't really care what people think as much as I did perhaps many years ago. I know this sounds quite American idealist, but your biggest limitation is you. It's inside you. And I've talked to many people about this. Don't really try and think about what you could do, what you could ask to do. You know, I really think that we limit ourselves often in this. I'd rather go for something and be rejected than think for the rest of my life what could have been. I've met many successful people over the years. They get rejected all the time. I do. Get used to it if you want to progress in life. It's hard, but I honestly think that's something that you should realize that happens to everyone. I hope this is helpful for you all, and I'll be interested what your reactions are to some of this stuff. Imposter syndrome. Some of you may have heard that term before. This idea that you go and present on stage something and you're worrying what the hell. What I still get this, by the way. Why is everyone listening to me? You know, they can't possibly be listening to me. What I found with that is even actors and famous people that I've met get imposter syndrome. They just wing it, basically. They just do it. So it's something that happens to us all. I think people often talk about working hard, and I think that's certainly part of success, but you've got to try and seek life-work balance, which I'm sure you're all aware of. Networking, so crucial. In this online world we find ourselves in now, you're not going to be able to do as much as that as you could do. But honestly, I would work on that as much as the content or knowledge that I know. This is all, if I could be your age again, sort of stuff. Don't prejudge others. I think often I've thought others are prejudiced against me, and often they're not. And I've sort of, yeah, I think just don't try and prejudge others. Brave, perhaps afterwards, because I'm just conscious of time, we'll go back there, but it's a process I use involving breathing and relaxation before I give presentations. I didn't have to do it because I knew you'd be such a nice audience for me today, but it's something that I can share with you. It's a sort of technique of calming down before having to present. And these I know they sound very corny, but ask for something seemingly out of reach. I honestly think you'll be surprised. You know, sometimes. So think about it. And I know you'd expect me to do this. Do something for someone. I try every day. Try and thank someone, or praise them where it's due. Anyway, I just wanted to offer some of those in this session, because it is a slightly different session to my usual more academic presentations. And then the other thing I just wanted to leave you with as well is, I do think that the young generation could make a difference, and you could all make a difference. And I'm often asked this, you know, because we can have debates about the world, the national policies, but what could we do as individuals? In the book, we talk about trying to create a national social mobility service. And I've been involved in advocating a national tutoring program and service, which has happened. I do think you could consider tutoring disadvantaged pupils in schools, for example. There's lots of charities that offer that now. Mentoring as well, particularly in the workplace, I find this an issue, that the big employers that I give talks to, often it's the more privileged employers that get the support, the mentoring, the championing. So I think we need to set up almost social mobility networks in the workplace and in universities to help each other. I think there's enough, many people that would like to do that. Campaigning, I think there is something to think about, and maybe we could discuss this together in time, about how we campaign to ensure that the companies we might work for, or the places we study at, or the places we invest in, themselves embrace social mobility. So are they paying people the minimum wage? Is there progression in that employees, so that the people from all backgrounds do make it to the top? You know, I've been so sort of in awe of some of the campaigns we've seen over the last couple of years in terms of the environment, or Black Lives Matter, etc. My dream, maybe I need to get Marcus Rashford to lead this or something. My dream would be a campaign on social mobility, and I'd love for that to happen with everyone. So one just last statistic to leave you with, if you weren't motivated to do something, and I'm sure you all are. This comes from one study we cited in one of the first books, and it looked at surnames. There's all sorts of caveats to this survey, but it's one of the few studies that looks at social mobility over the last 1,000 years. And it looked at surnames, Norman surnames, after 1066, after the Norman invasion. And about a century after that, it found, this study, that those with Norman surnames were 16 times more likely to get into Oxford and Cambridge in 1150 or whatever date it was. There weren't many universities around at that point, by the way. The depressing thing about this study was it fast forwarded 1,000 years to very recently, to the 21st century, and it found that those with Norman surnames were still 25% more likely to get into Oxford and Cambridge than those with average English surnames. So I just mentioned that study not to depress you even more, but just to say that this has been a problem in our society for a long time, and we're going to have to think really radically, I think, to challenge it. So I'm going to end there. I hope I've made this more positive and not negative. And yes, very happy to answer your questions. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lee. I think you're right in that some of the statistics are quite shocking, but I think I speak for everyone when I say that I found that incredibly interesting. And thank you for sharing your life lessons and wisdom as well. And I'm definitely feeling motivated after listening to you. So if we'd like to kick off with questions, I'm happy for people to put them in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand and ask yourself. We have been collecting a few on Instagram all day. So I guess I'll kick off with the first one, which I am quite interested to see what you think of. We have a question which is the American dream version of social mobility harmful to collective social advancement?
Wow, good question. I think it is, and I've got more whingy as I've become older about TV shows. I think we have a culture in the UK which is very individualistic. So, the X Factor or the Apprenticeship, all these shows tend to be modeled on picking one person who's the winner, and by implication everyone else is a loser. And I just find it, I find it quite depressing, actually, that notion of social mobility dominates the public debates. I think that we need to move away from this, because when I give talks around the country, particularly outside London and Manchester, the big cities, a lot of people say to me, "Lee, I don't particularly want to move from my local community." I mean, all your university students are different already in that they probably moved away from their home. But many people are saying, well, actually, I just want a decent job. I want a balanced life. I don't want a high paid job. I don't want the stress of that. I want the choice to be living here. So for me, that is a more sort of community, almost collective sense of what social mobility should be about. I think you should have the choice of going to a highly selective university if that's something you want to do, and going to London to do one of those jobs that I'm talking about. But it doesn't, success comes in many ways. And, I hope many people, for example, go into teaching and social. I'm very idealistic. Sorry, guys. And I think those careers should be paid more, but they are incredibly valuable to society. And we've kind of undermined some of those professions, I think, over the years because of this very individualistic capitalist notion of social mobility.
Great, thank you. So the next question is that what could junior employees at major employers, for example, law firms, do to facilitate social mobility?
So I've seen some really good practice in some of the employers that I go and talk to, and I'm going to talk to the BBC, by the way, next week. This is not for an interview or something. This is for actually talking to the staff and the senior people there. And one of the things I think you can do is have a proper mentoring program that's explicit, that is well defined, because if you don't, what the studies suggest is that informal networks are created. And again, it tends to be those from more privileged backgrounds that benefit from those networks. I also think, and law firms have been pretty good on this actually over the last 10 years, I think you should do more data gathering in businesses on who is being recruited, who's getting progression in the play, and who actually is at the top. Often you look at the boards of some of these companies and they are not diverse by social class, by ethnicity, by gender. For me, that's got to change. You have to change it from the very top. But for younger employees, I think that there are some really powerful examples, I think, of really good mentoring programs where you can help someone who might be slightly more junior to you. So that would be my hope, would be that you could do something like that.
Great, thank you. So the next question we have, quite interestingly, is do you think it is possible for grassroots organisation like the 93% Club to make change?
I do. I think this is a matter of belief. Do you think you can make change? I think you can. That's what excites me about you lot, the younger generation. I think you're more, it's hard. I mean, I haven't done research on this, is my opinion, but my sense is that your values are very strong. I think this comes up in discussions. When I was chief executive of the Sutton Trust, we used to get inundated with applications because people wanted to work for organizations that did good. It wasn't just about the money. The environmental causes that we've seen. I really think something like 93% group is in such a good, or club, I should say, it's such a good position to influence. We might come on to this, some of the debates in universities, how much support do we give to those from disadvantaged backgrounds when they come to university? We do a lot of work around access, and I talk a lot about admissions and being fair in admissions. Do we do enough to support people so that they feel included, both in the, not just the lectures, but also all the activities? I'll be very interested in the experiences here, because I certainly felt, even at Sheffield, because I was the first person in my family to go to university, I felt quite unusual, because I turned up without my parents are split up. So I turned up on my own on the train to Sheffield. And I remember feeling, not that anyone was nasty to me, but I certainly felt unusual. And I think some of the discussions that I was involved in even then, I just felt that I was being a bit excluded. Not that anyone was meaning to do that. So I think we could work much harder on universities as well as in wider society. I mean, one practical thing that we might follow up on after this is one of the things I'm trying to work out with the research on COVID that I'm doing on the inequalities during COVID is, how do we communicate that to a younger audience? And I'd be very interested in ideas from you all on that, because a lot of the, as you say, and I was on BBC Panorama and things like that, but it tends to be watched by 50-year-olds, and actually we want to get to those younger generations so that more people are aware of these issues. So some sort of help in terms of getting some of those messages out to a younger audience, I'll be very interested in.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I think it's probably only right that I kind of say something small here as well. And I'm probably quite biased answering that question, being founder of Exeter's 93% Club, but I am a great believer in mutual support. And I think that we not only have these networks at our individual universities, but all around the UK now. And it might be slightly optimistic to say, but I feel that even having these societies in place now all over the UK is a huge step to both voicing the inequalities and also making that tangible difference by working all together as well. Just what I was thinking about while you were speaking.
You all, by the way, you're all future leaders, I suspect. So I mean, you're going to be influential people. So I'm trying to plant these seeds now.
Thank you. Yeah. Next question we have from Sophie. She says that lots of inequality comes from privileged students being handed, often without choice, handouts, legs up, and ways to guarantee achievement. How do these handouts change in the context of disadvantaged students? Does it become fair, or is it the same principle in a different situation? Would you encourage disadvantaged students to grab opportunities if it would be claimed as unfair if a privileged student was in the same situation?
Really interesting. I mean, I think my emphasis, and partly this is pragmatic, so that some of my arguments do get supported in the political debates, is I tend to talk about levelling up. I know the government talks about this a lot now, but rather than stopping, for example, private tutoring, I think parents are going to do that. I do that, by the way, for my children. I don't think we should stop that. Do you remember that slide I put where you've got the balance between freedom for people to pursue opportunities against ensuring the disadvantaged get a fair chance? I think that has become, unfair. It has. We've reached a tipping point. But I think that in my view, you have to sort of level up. So that's why I've advocated the national tutoring program. There's some teething issues with that at the moment, but the idea is that if those from privileged backgrounds get tutoring, then let's create a scheme where those from more disadvantaged background can get those that support as well. I find these debates really fascinating, because I've got friends who that they won't invite me to dinner parties because they know this guy's going to sort of challenge them on what they've done. So and these are good friends of mine who went to state schools with me and helped me out when I was younger, but they have, for example, moved house to get into the highly sort of prestigious state school near them, and then they've moved back to where they come after their son or daughter's moved in. And that, for me, that's crossing the line. I wouldn't do that. And where you define the line seems to differ for different people, I've found. So another report I was involved in, and the Times reported on, was where parents were making up basically medical conditions for their children who were miraculously sort of recovered after they got into the school, because the admissions criteria allowed those with certain conditions to be in front of the queue. Again, see, my views, I wouldn't do that. So I think there's some things that I would exclude, and I think you have to be really tough on that, but you've got to also allow, in my view, people to try the best in terms of their, securing their children's futures. When you all have, I suspect most people on here, apart from me, that won't have children yet, honestly, the instincts as a parent really kick in, and you will want to do the best for your children. I think the other thing I would say with all this is we do have very, in my view, narrow sense of what success is. So, if one of my children says, well, actually, I don't want to go to university, I want to do something more creative, perhaps, or I would be very supportive of that. But I still feel that in the status game, in status, many families would see that as some sort of sense of failure. So I do think we need to think of success differently. And I actually think for you lot as well, as university graduates, you're going to get pressure to go into particular jobs. I would urge you all to think about the value you get from your jobs, particularly if you're going to do it day in, day out, by the way. So how we value success, I think, could be challenged as well. But I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, Sophie's nodding, so I think it did. Okay, so we've got another question in the chat, which is, what do you think would incentivize businesses to improve their social mobility, especially in super elite industries like academia? Do you think we've gone beyond moral incentives and it should be part of mandatory policy? And secondly, do you believe in positive action?
Wow, these are getting more tricky as we go along, aren't they? I feel like I'm doing a Viva now. You're all asking me some really good questions. I've actually, in many ways, become more radical as the years have gone on. And the reason for that is, I think if we leave it at the status quo, things will get worse. So, if we don't do anything, if you don't manage to do anything, the arms race that I was talking about just gets worse, in my view, every year. The advantage accrues advantage, and inequalities in many ways are getting wider. So I think you have to do some things. I do think you need to look at how we measure success in institutions. So there are now some social mobility rankings for employers now, and there's one released last week, and it's really interesting. I think it has incentivized some employers to look far more at their intakes and the progress within their employees, because they're getting publicly marked, if you like, on those. So I think you need more than just moral imperatives. Positive action, it depends what you mean by that. What I do worry about is tokenistic. So putting someone in a position who can't do the job. I think you can't, I think that actually ruins the argument in many ways. I think, I've talked a lot about in the book about being good enough. I think we obsess about grade, and you will all have experienced this for university. Is that person have? And the evidence suggests that actually, when you go over above a certain threshold, you're all pretty much as good as each other. And I think we should almost have a good enough policy that that those over certain grades would be allowed into the highly selective universities, but then we'd use other criteria. And I would look at social background in that. But the point there is that everyone would be able to prosper in that degree course or in that job. I think what I wouldn't do is put someone in a place that they can't then excel in that position. So positive action in some ways, but I think not I would call what I'd call tokenistic action.
Okay, great. I'm just going to go back to one of the questions we got asked on Instagram earlier, which was, do you think attitudes to social mobility have changed over the last few years? And why do you think this has happened or not happened?
So the public surveys show that there is increasing pessimism about social mobility, and that's probably because people like me have been talking about it a lot. It's interesting, the surveys in America show that people still believe in the American dream, even though that it doesn't exist. Whereas Brits tend to be a bit more pessimistic. I think so there's more recognition of these issues. I think what I tried to hint at with my presentation is I think it's very easy to get caught up in a sort of we can't do anything about this. You know, this is sort of pointless, and that's where I disagree, because I think we can do things. And you know, my generation, gay rights was a really big thing. You know, I wouldn't have predicted when I was your age just how that's moved on over one generation. I do think these things take time. I do think these are probably, you know, 10-year, 20-year changes. God, it's going to take a long time, isn't it? Unless all of you lot want to actually properly revolt. You know, there are some scholars in this field who have predicted that if we don't address inequality and social mobility, there will be some sort of revolt, because people at some point will say, well, actually, there's no point in contributing to society if we've got no chance of even having a decent life, let alone climbing the social ladder. I think it was 2030 or something like that. Someone predicted. There's even predictions on this. I wonder whether that will happen. I don't know. You'll have to tell me, guys. But I do think that those sort of people movements can be really powerful, I think. And if there was enough young people who were marching the streets saying to the government, look, you know, you've got to change some of your fundamental policies on this, I think there could be change. I really do. A footballer has changed the agenda on free school meals. The government caved in. Now, some people sort of said the government shouldn't cave in. You shouldn't cave into someone who isn't elected. But the fact really, I think for me, showed that one of the issues with social mobility is if those at the top all come from very similar privileged backgrounds, they don't empathize with the people, many of the people that they're intended to serve, and they just don't understand the extent of poverty. Whereas you had someone like Rashford, who's a very authentic figure who knows it, lived it, and he's changing our society quite profoundly. So there's more recognition of these issues, I think, than ever before.
Great, thank you. So Megan in the chat has asked, universities are offering many degrees these days for all kinds of subjects. Even some job roles which did not previously require degrees, such as healthcare roles, now require one. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so this I think is a very interesting debate. So nursing, for example, you know, over recent years has changed so that you now have to, my understanding is that you have to do now degrees for many of these sort of areas. And when I talk to nurses, I find it really interesting. Some of them say that actually, you know, nursing is a more practical sort of profession, if you like, and they're a bit skeptical of it. Whereas others say to me, well, actually, it's given nursing more status than it may have done before. So I think there's arguments for and against. I do. What I would say is one of my worries with the university system is that it's complex, particularly when you're trying to navigate this, when you're trying to think about. And I think the problem with that is that often it's the most disadvantaged students who end up doing the degree courses. I'm not going to name any, but I think there are some that aren't particularly good in some ways. You know, they don't have good outcomes. So I think you've got to be really careful. You know, there was a day, wasn't there, certainly for my generation, where university system was quite small, and basically there was less variation between different degree courses. Now I think there's 50,000 different combinations, isn't there, of degree offerings. So I do worry about that we need a clear, and again, that might be something the 93% Club might be able to help with. How do you ensure that people come to those decisions when they're going to cost, by the way, money now in a way that it didn't for me? You know, I didn't have any fees, and I had a full maintenance grant when I went to university. You'll all be astonished to hear. I think now that we have fees, I think there should be more of an onus on clearer information for those. And the other thing I would say is I think there's some really amazing apprenticeship routes now there's not enough, but they are starting to gather momentum, and I think they're good. For me, I have to say, I was one of those people who wanted to move away from home to go to a university, and I did experience an amazing time. You all will, by the way, when this COVID pandemic goes, you will, for those of you in your first year, but that experience is important to me outside the lecture theatres, if you like, as it was in. So I made friends involved in clubs, and I always urge the young people that I help be afraid of signing up to some of the more social activities at university, because I learned as much from that as the lectures in many ways. But university is not for everyone. Sorry, I'm rambling a bit now, aren't I?
No, you're all good. I think we have time for a couple more questions. So we've got one in the chat, which is, why is upward social mobility so much more difficult today than in the past?
So unfortunately, people like me climb the social ladder, right? So there's only so many slots on this ladder I keep talking about. And what's happened is over the last decades, some people climb the ladder. And when you climb the ladder, apart from me, of course, you're, and even I am prone to this, you want your children to do as well as you, right? So you climbed, you're now up there, and what you don't want is downward mobility. I actually think, again, it comes back to what we mean by success. And I've got some really good friends who have given up high pressure jobs to do something more for the environment, for example, who are living much more happy lives in many ways. So again, depends on what you judge by success. But because you've got people in the previous generations who climbed the ladder, there's literally no room, or there's not much room at the top. And so it's harder now for upward mobility to happen, because you've got to dislodge someone from that ladder in stark terms. And as I said at the very beginning of the presentation, was you're the generation, the first generation we know, certainly in recent history, where absolute rates have gone down. So that means that essentially there are less opportunities. Now, it's a separate discussion we could have about how do we create more opportunities. And I think that is another debate you could have. I actually think, apart from, I don't agree with everything Dominic Cummings said, but one of the things that I did agree with him on was investing in research and development, actually, because I think those sort of things where you're creating new companies and ideas and then making companies happen in the UK. I mean, one of the problems with the UK has been that we've got great ideas, but it tends to be other countries, notably the US, that then takes those and exploits them and creates these big companies. So yeah, we've got to create more jobs, but it is difficult, upward mobility. But think about what you want, right? Think about what you want from your life, because that's not, earning lots of money. I can tell you, not that I can tell you personally, but I can tell you from people I know, doesn't solve all the issues. I know it's important to some extent, but it doesn't solve all the issues.
Thank you. So we've had a sudden influx of questions now. I'm going to go with this one, which is, in your opinion, is imposter syndrome a direct reaction from the assertiveness and confidence that state school students might see in those more privileged private school backgrounds?
Yes, actually, and Annie, very, I don't know how much time we got, but very happy to answer any questions on those life lessons that I offered you all. I think you've got to get the balance right, though, for me, because I think it, for some people, names, it blur into arrogance, and I have tried to be more confident and assertive as I've got older, but I'm always polite to everyone. I don't look down on anyone. I think there are ways of doing it. But certainly, I think you're right. I remember when I was a young journalist many, many years ago at the Guardian newspaper. I was a young education reporter. This is many years ago, and they used to have this daily news meeting at the Guardian. I don't know if they still do it anymore. Well, probably not at the moment, but it was quite intimidating because there were hundreds of these journalists. They were all top journalists, and even though I might know more about that education topic, I was quite, believe it or not, I was quite scared to say anything because I thought I might slip up. I thought I might. And then I realized that some of my friends who came from more privileged backgrounds were just able to stand up and say things and get noticed, even though they knew less than me. And I think that was a hard one lesson for me because it showed me that you have to be good in these professions. There's no doubt about that. You do have to show your worth, but that's only half the story. The other half is getting noticed, and I did end up doing those sort of things, but I hope in a much more sort of humble way, in a way. But no, I would eventually speak up. But that was the sort of example that I would use for me. But it's really interesting because I don't think it necessarily means we all want to be an Etonian. I think you do it in your own way, but don't worry about what other people think about you.
I think that's a great note to end on, as we're reaching 6 o'clock. So I'm sorry if there's any questions that haven't been answered. I'm sure we will keep them for next time. But thank you so much, Lee. As I've said, I've found this incredibly insightful. And as I mentioned before, if you have any more questions for Lee or for any of us at the 93% Club, then honestly, feel free to pop us a message anytime. And if there's anyone here who doesn't have a 93% Club set up at their uni, then also feel free to pop us a message because we are always looking to expand. But yeah, thank you very much for coming, everyone. Lee, do you have any final words?
Thanks, everyone. I hope I've been optimistic, and I'm looking forward to seeing how this network grows. Let's carry on the conversation. I do also want to talk to you all about how I can get some of these messages out to the younger generation. I know you're probably all old, all right, already, aren't you, in relative terms to some of the teenagers that I'd love to think about how we get to those groups more, but perhaps we can carry that conversation on. Good luck, everyone. I'm just feeling for you all at the moment because it must be incredibly tough. There is a light at the end of the tunnel now. So yeah, good luck with all your studies, and do ask me any questions. Do come back to me. Thank you.